Now, it is a well-established fact that off-roaders, like the Tank 300, are not very fuel efficient. However, GWM is suggesting that the Tank 300 HEV, which we have here, might allow you to have your cake and eat it too. Now, under the bonnet of the Tank 300 HEV is its party piece, because the main thing you can see here is a 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder, which we're all very familiar with. However, that is mated to an electric motor, which is also powered by a 1.6 kilowatt-hour lithium ternary battery. Now, as a result, the Tank 300 HEV offers a total combined system output of 346 PS and 648 Newton meters of torque. Now, for comparison, the non-hybrid Tank 300 produces a mere 220 PS and 380 Newton meters of torque. However, unlike other hybrid models, the way GWM has put in the HEV system into this Tank 300 allows it to maintain its off-road credentials. So, for example, instead of having 2 electric motors mounted over each axle, instead the electric motor is sandwiched between the engine and the gearbox in a much more traditional setup. That gearbox has also been upgraded from an 8-speed auto in the Tank 300 to a 9-speed auto in the Tank 300 HEV. As a result, it means that this car has all of the same off-road capability that we've seen before, and we've appreciated hugely from the Tank 300, which means that, again, you have more power and greater efficiency without much in terms of compromise. Now, before we talk about styling, I'd like to talk specifically about the model that we have here. Now, the Tank 300, at least according to GWM, the Tank lineup as a whole, is meant to be very customizable. The idea is that there are a bunch of official accessories available but from GWM that allow you to make your Tank 300 look a little bit different and allow you to express your individuality as well as your adventurous spirit a little bit better, which is why the car that we have here is peppered in optional accessories. For example, this grille here, which has tank scripting across it, that is an accessory. The bumpers, front and rear, are metal. That's also an accessory. The over fenders are also different. Those are also accessories and are made of metal. And then there is the roof rack, where you have a wind deflector, a couple of bike racks, as well as something that looks like where you put it's one of those panels that you put underneath the wheels when you're off-roading if you need additional traction, as well as an awning. Now, unfortunately, GWM has not explained to us how expensive any of these accessories are, so unfortunately we can't tell that to you. However, I can confirm that all of these accessories are offered by GWM, which means that they are dealer-fitted options so that they do not mess with your warranty. Now, between the Tank 300 and the Tank 300 HEV, there are only very minor visual differences. The first and most obvious being colors. Now, the Tank 300 HEV is available with this sand beige color, which is exclusive to the hybrid model, whereas the Tank 300, the non-hybrid, gets a bright orange, which is exclusive to that car. The rest of the color palette, however, is shared. Now, aside from that, the rolling stock is also a little bit different. Now, the Tank 300 rides on 18-inch alloy wheels with a diamond cut finish wrapped in Michelin tires. However, for the hybrid, this car instead rides on 17-inch alloy wheels done up in gloss black and wrapped in Continental rubber. Now, both vehicles are suitably high quality and high performance in terms of their tire options. However, for the Tank 300 HEV, it is very clear that the slightly smaller wheel and tire setup is designed not only to improve efficiency, but also to maximize off-road capability. Aside from that, everything on the Tank 300 remains as is, which means that you get this very big, blocky SUV, which looks very much like an off-roader. You get big truck-like wing mirrors, which do fold automatically, as well as touch-type door handles on the left and right side, allowing you to lock and unlock the car without having to take the key out of your pocket. You also get running boards here, which are great for you to step up on, and you also get the same sort of cut-off look at the back, which makes this truck look very much like a proper off-roader. Now, because this car is peppered with accessories, you also get this accessory box here, which, while you can open it, frankly, the amount of space that you gain in it is quite small. And you do compromise quite a bit in terms of rearward visibility by having this here, which makes me question, as to why you'd want it in the first place. The same goes for the ladder that is on the other side, as well as the roof rack and the tent and stuff like that. For those of you who do have trucks like this and then cover it in accessories the way this car is, could you explain to me how you navigate underground car parks? Because it's been an absolute nightmare for me, with sometimes only a few centimeters of clearance left between the truck, or at least the top of the truck, and the roof of the underground car park. And at the rear of the Tank 300, we would like to point out that, again, this bumper is an optional accessory and is made of metal, which is why this car's blind spot monitoring and sort of rear or side assist functions do not work, except for the parking sensors and the reverse camera, thank heavens. Now, aside from that, the design of the rear of the Tank 300 HEV is exactly the same as the regular Tank 300, which means you have a massive swing door, you have an externally mounted spare wheel, which is full size, you have full LED tail lights here, replete with an LED indicator and reverse light. You just get HEV badging here to denote the fact that your car is slightly kinder to the environment, or your wallet. Now, in terms of boot space, these cars are, once again, identical, which means that in terms of overall cargo capacity, it remains exactly the same. It's not the most capacious boot in the world, but for 4 people's worth of luggage, or 5 in a pinch, you should have plenty of space. And you do get some netting here. You get the ability to lock this, if I do this, door, which means that once it's locked in place, it will not swing shut, which is great when you have this open on a slope. You get some hooks here, a couple of cubby holes, you get more netting, as well as not only a 12-volt socket, but also a household socket, which means that you can actually use your car to power household appliances should you take this car camping. Now, before any of you ask me, I am aware of the fact that there is a massive box in the boot. This is the Arcane Warrior Pack, which comes with all of the crap on the roof. Now, I'm not entirely sure what's supposed to be in here, because upon opening it, there's nothing in it. Which means that this is probably just a very handy, very rugged looking storage box, but as far as I'm concerned, it's just taking up boot space and making an awful racket every time I go over a speed bump. But, you know, if you want all the accessories, I'm going to make your car look like some rugged macho nonsense, I suppose this just comes with it. Now, you can fold the rear seats 60-40 for added practicality, which makes your Tank 300 a little bit more practical than it otherwise would be should you need to move house or carry a large plant. But for the most part, the Tank 300 is not the most spacious or most practical truck within its space, or at least compared to other SUVs sort of within the same price bracket. So it's all stuff we've covered before, and nothing's really changed with this, even though it is now a hybrid. Now, the inside of the Tank 300 HEV is identical to that of the regular Tank, which means that you have really good materials all the way around. You've got these 2 sort of centrally mounted vents here, which are also joined by this centrally mounted clock, around which there are buttons, which I'll touch on a bit later. And all of this is illuminated the way you get in a Mercedes-Benz. You also get a set of physical buttons here for the HVAC controls, and more physical buttons down here. You get grab handle there, ambient lighting, infinity audio system. It's all very nice in here. The seats are also identical to the regular Tank 300, which means that you get ventilation as well as massage function for the front seats, which is nice, as well as memory functionality for the driver. In terms of ergonomics, everything falls very easily to hand. The steering wheel is very adjustable, which means that it's quite easy to get into a comfortable driving position. And one of the things that I've noticed that GWM has done is that all of the warning lights on this digital instrument cluster are actually curved, sort of where the curvature of the steering wheel is, which means that nothing is blocked, which is a nice attention to detail. Now, in terms of the overall layout of this cabin, I do think it is quite smart because, like I said, there are plenty of physical buttons. So, for example, around this centrally mounted clock, you have buttons for the front and rear diff locks, as well as the front and rear demisters, as well as your emergency hazards. Moving further down, you get 2 knobs, one here to control this car's drive modes, of which there are 6. And then on the other side, you also have a knob to change this car from all-wheel drive to 4 low, should you be going on some particularly challenging surfaces. Moving further down beyond that, you now get buttons for this car's ventilated front seats, of which there are 3 levels, so you just press them multiple times, although you can also access it through the screen. You get a button for this car's 360-degree camera, the off-road cruise control, which allows you to maintain a slow speed over difficult surfaces, so the car does the majority of the work, as well as a button here for this car's tank turn function. Now, tank turn works by locking the inside wheels during a corner in order to reduce your turning circle. It only works at very, very low speeds, but it can be very helpful when you're driving off-road. Now beyond that, there are also a bunch of physical buttons here on the steering wheel, which is also always nice to see. You get a bunch of buttons on the left side to control this car's infotainment system, a bunch on the right to control this car's adaptive cruise control and other advanced driver assist features and manipulate the instrument cluster up ahead of you. You also get a set of paddle shifters behind the steering wheel to control this car's 9-speed automatic gearbox, and overall everything in here just feels quite nice and quite sensible. In terms of quality, everything fits together quite nicely. In terms of practicality, you get a wireless charging pad here, USB-C and USB-A port. You get a small tray mounted here for smaller items, under which sits a set of cup holders as well as a relatively deep center console bin, which is air conditioned. You also get a decently sized glove box here, which unfortunately is not lined in felt, which means anything you put in there will rattle about. And you have decently sized door bins big enough for a 1.5 liter size bottle. You also get a grab handle here should you be off-roading and your passenger might need a little bit more support. Now beyond that, the technology in this car is also quite impressive. You get a couple of 12.4-inch screens. The central one does, of course, the myriad of this car's functions, as well as adjusting a lot of this car's functionality and settings. You also get an off-road mode here, which allows you to keep an eye on not only your tire pressure, but also your pitch and roll angle, your altimeter and altitude levels, as well as your overall heading. So today I learned, after having filmed here for many years, we are now facing east. Now beyond that, you also get wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which takes up the entirety of the screen. Now this does load and work quite well as far as I'm concerned, and as far as functionality is concerned, it does also respond quite well. Even though this is not the largest screen in the world, it is relatively snappy, the graphics load quite quickly, and overall it does seem to be a pretty decent companion. Now beyond that, you have a 12.4-inch digital instrument cluster, which also gives you a myriad of options in terms of customization of what information you want displayed to you at any given time, and overall it just feels nice in here, much like the Tank 300. Although because this car is a hybrid, you also get the option of a power mode here, which allows you to see this car's energy consumption and keep track of this car's battery level. Although because this is not a plug-in hybrid, you never really pay attention to that. Although it is nice to see just how much power and fuel is used over any particular time. That's just nice. Now, beyond all of this, there are some things about this car that I'm not the biggest fan of. Firstly, the fact that this car uses a USB-A and USB-C port. The USB-A actually connects to the infotainment system, which means that if you want to use wired Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, you have to have a USB-A to USB-C cable. However, this USB-A port is terribly slow, which means that no matter what you plug into this, it just will not charge your phone while you're using it to power Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. That I find to be a bit annoying. The other thing that I don't quite like is the fact that this upper console area here, which is where you find this car's sunglasses holder, just feels to be built of a slightly lesser quality material than you'd expect from something that is pushing north of ~250,000 ringgit. The plastics here are just not very nice and they are quite scratchy. The other annoyance, although that's particular to this car, is the fact that while it does come as standard with a sunroof, not a panoramic roof, just a sunroof over the front seats, because of this car's roof rack and optional accessories, it's basically useless. Although it has been relatively useful for me to keep track of beams I might be driving under as I navigate my condo car park. Speaking of navigation, I do appreciate the fact this car's 360-degree camera is very good, which means that if I were to show you, there are a myriad of different angles for you to see from, and you also have the option of making this car or giving this car a transparent chassis, which means that when you are driving off-road, you get a better view of what might be underneath the vehicle. But in addition to that, visibility all the way around the car is also pretty good. All the pillars are nice and thin, there's plenty of glass. However, once again, the mounted accessories on this car have limited rear 3/4 visibility, because on my right there is that storage box and on my left there is the ladder, which means that if I'm looking over my shoulder to reverse out of, say, one of those angled parking spaces, that might be a bit of a challenge. But aside from that, life in here is pretty good, and I don't really have many complaints for a car at this price point. Now, life in the back of the Tank 300 HEV is a pretty positive affair. With the front seat set in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, I have a good amount of knee room and a pretty decent amount of headroom. And in terms of the seats themselves, they are very comfortable. So for example, I don't have recline adjustment, but the seats themselves are very soft and very squishy, which means that as I'm sat here, I have a good amount of overall support, not just on my upper half of my body, but also the lower half of my body, which means that sat here, it is pretty comfy, and I'd be quite comfortable to do do a long distance trip in this car if necessary. On top of that, the floor in this car is almost completely flat, and because the front seats are mounted quite high, I have plenty of space to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me. And even if there were 3 passengers back here, this center seat is not overtly raised, although it's not very wide, which means that again, if you have a passenger back here or 3 passengers back here, they should be comfortable for at least a couple of hours at a stretch. Now, beyond that, in terms of material quality, life is also pretty good here because you still get more of this stitch material here, more of the stitch material here. The tops of the door cards, however, are hard, scratchy plastic, which I do find to be quite annoying, again, given the fact that this is a 260,000+ ringgit vehicle. But overall, in terms of practicality, I have a couple of USB-A ports, again, pitifully slow. I get door bins big enough for a litre-sized bottles, pockets behind the front seats, as well as deployable center armrests here with a couple of cup holders. There are also ISOFIX mounts, which are relatively easy to locate, although the door opening at the rear is not very wide, which means that that will present rather something of a challenge as you try and fit a bulky rear-facing child seat. Although that said, because there is a decent amount of space within the car, a bulky rear-facing child seat should not be fighting up against the seat in front of me, which is a positive thing. There are also a couple of crotch coolers, by the way, which are okay, I guess. But overall, I do think the back end of the Tank 300 HEV is not compromised in any way, at least no more or no less compared to that of the regular Tank 300, which means that there isn't really that much to discuss back here. However, what has changed significantly is the way this car drives, at least in one particular area. Now, the thing about driving the Tank 300 hybrid is that it gives you this idea that because there is an HEV badge on the back, this thing must be incredibly efficient. Like, you'd think that this car should also be able to do 1,000 kilometers between fill-ups the way you can on, say, an H6 HEV, or, for example, be able to leave absolutely everybody dead at the lights the way you can in a GWM Way G9. Unfortunately, however, that's not really the way it works in this car. Instead, the hybrid system in the Tank 300 is designed primarily to make this car feel a little bit more powerful than what the 2-litre on its own would be able to provide. Now, the first time we drove the Tank 300, I did say that this is not a particularly fast car. But then again, anyone who drives a vehicle like this or is looking at a vehicle like this surely would not have any realistic expectations of it being particularly fast. It's not really the point of vehicles like this. It's not about being able to cover a great amount of distance in a short amount of time. It's the ability to be able to cover any distance over any sort of terrain. That's the function of a vehicle like this. And therefore, the powertrain that was fitted to the Tank 300 Turbo, or the non-hybrid model, felt adequate to do just that. It had enough power for the car to go about its business, and more importantly, it was able to put that power down in a way that allowed you to traverse difficult terrain without too much difficulty. Now, for the Tank 300 HEV, things are a little bit different because thanks to the electric motor that's able to provide a significant amount more torque in a much more immediate fashion, it does mean that when you drive this car around, it does feel significantly more powerful compared to the non-hybrid model. In fact, I would argue that this HEV system does a very good job at emulating a very large capacity and very large displacement naturally aspirated petrol engine because the power arrives very linearly. It is also incredibly smooth, and more importantly, as a result of the additional torque and power being provided by the electric motor, at no point does this 2-litre 4-cylinder turbocharged engine feel strained. And the resulting result of that is that as you drive this car around, it just feels a lot less strained. It doesn't feel like this car is struggling in any way to move about, which is nice compared to the outgoing model. Now, in terms of overall comfort and refinement, now talking specifically about comfort and ride comfort, this car has had some degree of sort of fettling in order to help the suspension cope with the additional weight that comes with this hybrid system. If I'm not mistaken, I think the hybrid system on its own adds an additional 300 kilograms or something like that, in fact, or less than that. And so as a result, they've had to make some changes to the way this car's suspension is set up. Now, that hasn't compromised it in any way. In fact, the Tank 300 remains one of the most comfortable vehicles to drive because it goes over potholes or any issues whatsoever. Imperfections in the road are basically non-existent, also helped by the fact that this car rides on slightly smaller alloy wheels. And overall, it just still feels very civilized. And compared to vehicles like, say, the Suzuki Jimny, or in fact, the outgoing 3.6-liter V6 Jeep Wrangler, which is a car I spent a lot of time in, this feels much more refined and much more civilized. In fact, if you were to compare this to something like a Land Rover Defender, the original Defender, not the current $1 million one, then this car feels positively luxurious next to it. In fact, the GWM Tank 300 does a very good job at feeling luxurious in general thanks to this car's excellent build quality. The thing about GWM is that it's very clear that they're not really focused too much on the mass market space, at least not for the time being. Because, for example, if you look at the current lineup of GWM products in Malaysia, you only have the H6 HEV sort of sitting as a mainstream product. Now you also have the GWM Aura 05. But aside from that, the majority of their products sit on the higher end of the scale. And so you have the Tank 300, which starts at about 250,000 ringgit. And then you have the Tank 500, which is even more expensive than that. You have the Way G9 Luxury PHEV MPV, which is also considerably expensive. So because of that, it's quite clear that GWM's focus is more on low volume, high margin products, which mean that these vehicles need to be built very well. And compared to a lot of other Chinese cars, the Tank 300 has always impressed in terms of build quality, which means that as you drive about, everything in this car feels so incredibly well screwed together, and it all feels very refined. And in fact, that refinement actually extends all the way up to wind noise, which is quite impressive in and of itself, given the fact this car has the aerodynamic properties of a small block of flats. Now, when you drive this car at motorway speeds, you'd be very impressed to know that wind noise is very well managed. Despite the massive truck-like wing mirrors and the very flat windscreen and so on, despite that, the amount of wind whistle that gets into the cabin is relatively minimized, at least from the bottom half of the cabin. Unfortunately, the vehicle that I'm driving today has quite a bit of noise coming from the roof, and I've no doubt that is as a result of the accessories that have been fitted to it, because I don't think those accessories have been subject to the same amount of wind tunnel testing as the rest of the car. And road noise, even though this car rides on all-terrain tires, is also pretty well managed, although again, I can't really speak to overall refinement in terms of road noise because this car rides on optional accessory over-arch fenders. Because, as you may or may not know, stock fenders may have some degree of sound deadening fitted to them, etc., in order to sort of improve overall road noise. And so because this car rides on aftermarket over fenders, I can't really comment that much on road noise, but I can say that it is relatively quiet, although it could be quieter if you had the standard setup. That's all I'm saying. And so that does mean that when you have a truck like this, driving it around day to day, doing your daily errands and stuff like that, it feels truly effortless, even more so than the Tank 300, which is already a very impressive car in and of itself. This Tank 300 HEV just feels so very civilized. It feels like the sort of truck that you can live with every day without any issue whatsoever, because it is comfortable, it's refined, it's got a great audio system through the Infinity audio system that you get as standard in this car, and you've got massage seats, ventilation, etc. It's all just very civilized. Now, one of the areas that I did complain about before, the last time I drove the Tank 300, was this car's ADAS system. In fact, every GWM seems to have a very weak advanced driver assist suite of systems. Now, I say this because the systems that work in an event of an emergency, for example, things like the AEB, the emergency lane keep assist, etc., all those things function just fine, exactly the way you'd expect them to. Unfortunately, the convenience features that come with the ADAS suite from GWM desperately need a polish. The adaptive cruise control, for example, maintains way too far a distance between you and the vehicle in front. And I can say that that's not just calibrated for the Tank 300 HEV because it's a big, heavy body-on-frame SUV, but all GWMs do that. And as a result, it means that even when you're in stop-start traffic, because of the monumental gap between you and the vehicle in front, it is inevitable that someone will cut you off. Which means that when I tested this on the LDP, it basically meant I was just standing still because everybody was in front of me, which was very annoying. The lane departure warning is not so bad. It's not overly intrusive, but the lane centering assist is very fidgety, which means that if you intend to use that over a long motorway journey, you will find that the car is constantly sort of twitching left and right in a very unnatural sort of fashion, which means that progress doesn't feel as smooth or as effortless as you'd expect, at least not compared to vehicles that you'd get from, say, out of Japan or out of Korea, for example. Chinese car makers really need to work on their advanced driver assist features, because I think that is, at this point, one of the weakest links in this entire sort of setup. But at the very least, as I said, all of the emergency systems, all of the advanced driver assist features that are meant to activate during or in event of an emergency, all those things work fine, which means that if you do want to travel with your family in the car and cover long distances and go on adventures and stuff like that, the Tank 300 HEV will keep an eye on you. Now, I'd like to touch on fuel economy just a little bit, because again, there may be some of you looking at the Tank 300 HEV and thinking, I can have my cake and eat it too. I can have a truck that is big and imposing and macho man, whatever, without spending a small fortune every time I go to the pump. Unfortunately, the Tank 300 HEV doesn't do a particularly good job. Now, subject to our testing with this car through a bevy of different situations, which included traffic jams as well as long distance runs at motorway speed, etc. Unfortunately, the number that we're getting out of this car is 9.6 kilometers per liter, which works up to 10.4, if I'm not mistaken, 10.4 liters to the 100 or something to that effect, somewhere a little bit north of 10 liters to the 100. Now, that is an improvement over the Tank 300 non-hybrid, because if I recall correctly, that car was doing about 11 to 12 liters to the 100, and so that is an improvement. But more importantly, I would like to point out the fact that, number one, I don't think anybody's buying a vehicle like this thinking about fuel economy, and secondly, more importantly, that number has been achieved without any compromise in terms of performance. This car has been able to keep up with everybody else on the motorway. It's been able to drive us very smoothly through traffic, like I'm doing right now. And overall, this powertrain has performed incredibly well throughout our time with it, which means that a little over 10 liters to 100 still feels perfectly reasonable for a vehicle like this. And so I'm not overly disappointed. However, there is a Tank 300 that you can buy in foreign markets that's available with a plug-in hybrid system. And I suspect that for buyers who will be looking at a Tank 300, it's something to drive, 5 days a week going to and from work, and then on the weekends going on adventures, you might appreciate having the flexibility of a plug-in hybrid system, although that's not offered in Malaysia, unless you pressure GWM to bring it in. So where do I stand with the Tank 300 HEV? Well, I do think that this is a much better product overall compared to the standard Tank. The flexibility of this powertrain, the availability of torque when you need it, and the smoothness of the operation overall just make this a very, very likable package. When you pair that to the fact that Tank 300 was already very impressive in terms of comfort, in terms of packaging, refinement, specifications, safety systems, etc., it just means that the Tank 300 HEV is just an improvement on an already good package. And as far as I'm concerned, if you are on the market for a proper sort of overlander SUV like this, I would urge that you consider the Tank 300 HEV over the Tank 300, because I think that, as I said, this entire package just feels a lot more sensible and a lot more livable day to day compared to the Tank 300. Now, of course, if you are looking at a vehicle like this for proper off-roading, if that's like really genuinely your thing, then perhaps only in such a scenario would you be better off with the non-hybrid model, simply because there'll be fewer components, you're not too fussed about fuel economy, and I can attest to the fact that the turbo model is incredibly tough. In fact, I've seen one of these things drive into like a set of concrete stairs at like 80 kilometers an hour, smack the sump guard, and still keep going for the rest of the day. Like, these cars are tough, which means that if you do intend to go off-roading, don't sniff at this just because it's a Chinese vehicle. The GWM Tank 300 will reasonably keep up with whatever it is that you might expect of it. However, if you're not interested in something quite so large as this, and more importantly, if you're not all too fussed about proper off-road capability, then there is also the Jetour T2, which seems to be very popular among many people. Although I would like to point out that that car is a unibody or a monocoque chassis built vehicle, which means that it's not going to be as tough as a Tank 300. Its off-road capabilities, based on testing done in South Africa by the great people at cars.coza, which is a channel that I watch quite a lot, their off-road testing with that car has also proven that its off-road capabilities are relatively limited, and so that's really a car for style, whereas the Tank 300 is a bit more about substance. Although, of course, the Jetour is also about 150 grand, whereas this is about 260, so there's a very big gap there. But anyway, as far as I'm concerned, I do think the Tank 300 HEV is a vehicle that I could very easily recommend to the sort of people who are looking for cars like this, because it is very capable, it's very livable, and as I'm doing 90 kilometers an hour down the north-south highway, down the federal highway, it feels very reasonable. I do quite like this. And so that concludes our review of the 2026 GWM Tank 300 HEV. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icons, and every time we make a new upload, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel so you can stay up to date with the very latest updates from us and the Malaysian automotive industry. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.